In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the intake gaskets on this Ford Ranger with the 4.0 liter V6. Let's get started. Because we're going to be disconnecting sensitive electronics, I'm going to disconnect the negative battery terminal. Use an 8mm socket, cut the current flow through everything. Set this aside, make sure it doesn't jump back on and make connection by accident. On the passenger side of the front of the frame here where the radiator sits, you may have this shield, and this will prevent you from cleanly basically draining the coolant, otherwise it's going to splash on the inside of this and get all over. So I'm going to remove the two 10mm bolts that hold it onto the frame on this side. This is going to allow me to pull it down. It's got a push clip also. There we go. Once we pull this down and out of the way, you can see the petcock right here. And we can put a collection bucket right underneath it. Instead of splashing all over the shield, it'll drain right into the bucket. Take a 19mm wrench or socket, put it right over here, break it free. You can even do this with pliers or by hand if it's not too tight, but a lot of times they get stuck. And just unthread this until coolant starts coming out. There we go. Don't pull this all the way out though, otherwise it'll start shooting backwards. I just wanted to note that there may or may not be a cover covering this area of your engine. There should be, as you can see, these three bolts right here were supposed to be for a cover, so remove the three 7mm screws that hold the cover on. Pull that off and then we can continue. Let's start by removing the intake tube here. There are two clamps, 8mm bolt on each, one here on the intake or on the throttle body and one on the air filter side. Loosen both up. Before we pull this off, there's going to be a vacuum line going here on the back side of it. To get this off, pull the green tab backwards and sideways. That should unlock it. Sometimes you'll need a pocket screwdriver to help you out. With it unlocked, you should be able to pull it off of here. All right, set that to the side. Now you can pull the entire intake tube off. It might be a little bit stuck. Give it a couple twists to break it free. And, oh, looks like it has a clip here for the mass airflow sensor. Remove that. Pry this off with a trim tool. Take this and set it aside. Next, let's disconnect the throttle cable, and because this truck has cruise control, it has this extra cable here. To get this off, if that's the case for you, pull the throttle blade open, or this actuator here, and then this cable is going to slide off going forward towards the front of the vehicle. It might be a little bit stuck, but there you go, it should pop off. You can let go of this, and now, because these cables go in two separate directions, I'm going to take the cruise control cable off of the bracket, pull it through, and leave this one attached and just move the entire bracket to the side. To do that, take a trim tool and press on these little tabs, press the cable through. Take that out, set this cable to the side. Now let's take this cable off. Move the throttle blade in the open position. This should be able to pull out of here. I'm going to spray it with some rust penetrant because it looks like it's fairly stuck in there. It's seized. It's got an aluminum end to it, and it's pretty much stuck inside the plastic. So we're going to let that soak for a minute while we remove this bracket with two 8mm bolts. And when I have a lot of small bolts like this, I like to put them right back where they belong. That way I don't accidentally lose them. I'm going to try and gently create some vibrations here. So in my case, this cable is pretty stuck here, and maybe eventually it'll loosen up. But because of this, what I'm going to do is pull the throttle body off of the intake and just set the entire thing off to the side. So we already have this bracket disconnected. It looks like it's only 4 bolts, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and 1 electrical connector here for the throttle position sensor. Looks like someone has electrical taped this to itself. So we're going to have to undo this so we can actually access the locking tab. The locking tab is on this side. Press it, slide it off, set it to the side. Take an 8mm socket and break free and remove all 4 of the bolts. I'm going to break them all free first. Can't really see the ones underneath. They're broken free, so to speed things up, I'm just going to use an air ratchet. Now you can take this entire assembly, set it to the side. Now we have to pop off this wire off of its retainer, set that to the side, disconnect the idle air control valve, or unplug it I should say, move the wiring aside. At the top of the EGR control valve here, or vacuum valve, remove the vacuum line. Be careful with it, you don't want to break it. And then we do have to remove the EGR valve from it, so you have two options. Either you can pull these bolts off of the intake and pull it out of here, or remove these two. There's one just like this on the other side for this EGR valve to the bracket itself. It might seem easier to remove these off of the bracket, but keep in mind that this slides into the intake, so you'll have to pull it sideways to get it out, and with the EGR tube still connected, it's going to be difficult. So if I can, I will try, but if I can remove these bolts successfully, I would rather do that because this is a flat area here with a flat gasket, so everything can just separate without having to pull it sideways. As you can see, I already sprayed this with rust penetrant, so hopefully it had time to do its job. Oh, well, this one's coming out pretty easily, so that's good. Let's try the other one. I was able to wire brush this one, the other one not so much. Can't really get to it. It's a little more difficult to see even. Let's see. Yep, that one breaks free. All right, that's good news. So let's take these out all the way. We'll move on. There's the other one. They're both the same. There we go. This pulls off, so we can just leave this here. It does have a little bit of wiggle room to it, so that's perfect for when we pull the rest of the intake off. Looking a little bit further behind the EGR, you'll see this vent valve here. Unplug it and unplug the two vacuum lines that go to it as well. You could unbolt it off the intake, but it's just as easy to pull this off, and then you don't disturb the gasket that's on there. So this can stay with the intake. We have to remove these two vacuum hoses off of the intake. Grab some pliers, squeeze the clamp. It looks like this one, the hose is coming off with it. That's totally fine. Set that aside. Do the same to the other one. Pull the clamp off, twist the hose, pull it off. This one's for the brake booster, so make sure it's in good condition. I mean, all of them, you want to make sure they're still good, but this one's important because you lose power brakes if you don't have good vacuum here. Now we have to pull the spark plug wires off of the intake here. So remove this retainer that holds them on. Pull this off of the intake, and we'll have to unplug the plug wires off of the coil. To unplug these wires, you want to know how to plug them back in properly so that the engine can fire in its proper order. So here's an overview so that you can understand what's happening and how to put it back together. The engine is a V6. This is cylinder number 1, so front passenger side is cylinder number 1. And typically the cylinder that is the most forward of the two banks is bank 1, cylinder 1. And don't go by the intake on this because the intake runners are actually backwards on this. So the first intake runner that sits first in line is actually this one over here, but that's not cylinder 1. And the way Ford numbers the cylinders, it goes 1, 2, 3 passenger side, 4, 5, 6 driver side. So those are the numbers of the cylinders. And the way this correlates to the ignition coil, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So just in a circle, starting from the back passenger side all the way around to the front passenger side. So basically the spark plug wire for number 1 goes here, wire for number 2 goes here, and so on and so forth. Having said that, because I have that figured out at this point, I'm going to unplug them without marking them. I can just follow the wire. If you want to mark them, go ahead and mark them with something, either a permanent marker, a crayon, whatever you have. But we need to unplug these, the ones that go over the intake, so cylinders number 1, 2, and 3, so that we can get them out of our way. On the passenger side front of the intake, you'll see this connector here. Let's pull that off, set that to the side. Now we have to remove the two 8mm bolts that hold the bracket for this ignition coil pack onto the intake. Let's see if we can pull back on this. So it looks like we have enough space here, enough give in the bracket to pull it away when necessary, when trying to remove the intake. If for some reason you don't have enough space, you can follow the bracket down and unbolt it from the block. But to me, this should be plenty of space to remove everything. On the passenger side of the firewall, you'll see this main connector. This is for the engine's computer. We're gonna have to disconnect this because the wiring harness runs along where we have to put a socket down to remove the intake manifold bolts. So use a 10mm socket on this, unthread this bolt all the way. It will not come out, it will just release basically, so it's not going to come out of the connector. But it will release the connector. You can see it's already starting to pull away. There we go. Let's remove this 11mm mounting nut on the firewall so we can pull this harness aside. Looks like right behind it, we have to remove the stud also because of a ground connector. Use the same 11mm. Break that free. Take this off. I will put these back together so that I know that these two stay together. Now this is free, so let's flip it over towards the driver's side. Grab it over here and just secure it wherever. Make sure you don't put too much tension on the wires though. Now use a T30 Torx bit, and we're going to work our way from the outside to the center and remove all bolts that hold this intake on. They're kind of hidden, so you're going to have to look straight from the top to see them. Doesn't matter which side you start on, but I'm going to go in a cross pattern to release pressure evenly off of this intake. Once again, it's a T30 Torx bolt. Make sure your socket is seated properly. They are mounted on rubber bushings, so that's what that sound is. This one back here is the reason we had to remove that wiring harness. To break these free, it's best to put just constant pressure on it by hand. All right, all 8 should be broken free, so I'm going to grab the air ratchet now and zip those out of there. At this point, the order does not matter anymore because they're loose. Okay, they should all be loose now. All right, at this point, we should be able to lift the intake up. There we go. Now right next to the throttle body, where the upper radiator hose swoops down, you'll see these 3 hoses right here, and I waited to take these off until the intake was loose so we can move it around as needed. But take the hose clamps off, or not off, just pull them away, and then if you just wiggle this, it should want to break free and pop off of here. There we go. Now let's disconnect this lower one, and here's where it comes in handy to be able to lift the intake just a little bit so you can get to this clamp. Okay, pull that backwards. Once you do, break this hose free just like the top one. Set that aside. Don't forget which hose goes where. Then we're left with this one in the center here, which disconnects right here. Spin this clamp up a little bit so I can grab it, move it, and try to pull this off. There we go. So this is disconnected now. Let's move to the other side. There's one more line on that side. And on the driver's side, you'll see this line with the white clip that goes into the intake. Take a screwdriver and tap this down. That should unlock it. Then you can pull this out. Now, Let's try to pull this intake up. Get this to move to the side. There we go. Pull this bracket backwards. There we go. That releases the intake. Pull straight up and out. And there is your intake. Now it's time to do some cleanup here, not just around the ports of the intake, but also there have been some rodents making a house here. So let's get rid of all that so we can continue with our job. Now with some rags on the intake runners to cover up the holes, let's take a razor blade and clean off all of this debris, corrosion, and buildup that's around the runners so that the intake gaskets can seal up perfectly. You don't want any air leaks around those gaskets. And the reason I said to use a razor blade is because it is a lot less likely to damage the aluminum head. So I'll just try and scrape off everything that you can. It's not going to look perfect, but you can at least get all the raised areas off, get the corrosion and buildup off, and avoid using something such as a coarse sandpaper, or even sandpaper, even if it's fine. Don't use it by hand, use it on a sanding block. You want this area to stay nice and flat, otherwise the intake will not seal up. You'll have air leaks and then a running condition. So take a razor blade and go around all 6 of the runners. I got it as clean as I could. Let's remove the rags. Make sure nothing stays in the runners, of course. Blow some compressed air to make sure that nothing actually is there. Then you want to use some brake parts cleaner on a clean rag and just degrease the entire surface where the gasket will sit, on both sides, of course. Now with the intake upside down, let's take a pocket screwdriver or a pick and remove all the gaskets for the air intake runners. All right, wipe this area down. I'm also going to take compressed air and go in the slot for the gasket to blow any debris out. Now you want to take your new gaskets, line them up, press them down. They are non-directional, and all of the runners are the same here gasket-wise, so it doesn't matter which one you put where or in which direction. They are slightly ovalized, so make sure you follow that just so it can fit in better. And they do have little tabs on the side that help it lock into place better. So once you press it on, it should stay seated and should stay locked in. Shouldn't want to fall out. If it falls out, that means it's not seated all the way. Make sure all of them are flat all the way around. Well, not flat, but fully seated all the way around. Otherwise, it won't seal up. You'll have an air leak and problems down the line. All right, so these are done. Right here where the EGR valve mounts, I'm going to try and scrape off the old gasket and any debris that's here. Get this as clean as you can, and then we'll do the same on the EGR valve side. And then, of course, we will be ready to mount the intake back on the engine. We also need to replace the throttle body gasket. Take the old one out. The entire seat of the gasket looks very clean, so I'm just going to install a new one. There we go. And that's all set to go back on the intake. Now let's get the intake reset back on the engine. As you set it down here, make sure the bolts don't get stuck. They don't come out of the intake, so you have to kind of lift the intake up, slide it back and then down, and make sure the bracket goes in where it needs to. Also, at the same time, make sure the gaskets don't fall off of the intake, of course, on the bottom. Gotta clear the fuel line at the front here. There we go. All right. Oh, that's sitting pretty much where it needs to be. I'm gonna give it a quick inspection with a flashlight. Everything looks perfect. Yep, bolts line up. Nothing is pinched, no wires, no hoses, nothing like that. Everything is still as it should. EGR lines up, vacuum hoses line up, the bolts for the ignition coil line up. So, all right, we're all set to move on. Let's get the PCV valve reconnected here. This is a heated PCV, so it has coolant hoses going through it. I'll reconnect the bottom one first. This is why I'm doing this now, because as you remember, to remove it, it was useful to be able to lift the intake out. Hose clamp needs to slide back a little bit, give me a little more space for the hose to slide on. The hose needs to be completely bottomed out, or at least most of the way. There we go. That should be good right there. Resecure the clamp. Get this clamp seated about halfway between the end of the fitting and the end of the hose. Now let's get this hose reconnected and get this clamp put back on, just like that. And then the top hose, slide this one on, resecure this clamp where it belongs. And there we have it. This is reconnected. Reconnect the knock sensor, or resecure, I should say, the knock sensor connector on the intake since we're here. On the EGR side, let's put the new gasket in, hold it tight up against the intake, and then start at least one bolt. This will clamp the gasket in there, prevent it from moving. As you can see, it's spinning around, but as soon as you get this one bolt started, you can spin it right back into place, start the other bolt on the back side. There we go. That gasket is seated. I'm not going to tighten this yet. I want to wait to tighten the intake first, but I just wanted these started so that the gasket can be all set in place. The EGR is lined up, but it won't be tight. Get this harness up and over. Might as well put the vacuum hose back while we're here. Reconnect the idle air control valve. This is for the throttle body, so we'll leave this here. And right behind the EGR, there was that sneaky vacuum hose right there. Let's reconnect that. All you have to do to reconnect it is line it up and press it on till it makes a click noise. Looks like I need a little bit of help prying it on here. Be very gentle if you have to do this, of course. There we go. Had to push that connector down, it was a little stiff. That's locked in. Continuing with the vacuum lines here. Put these two on this valve. There we go, plug it in. And one last vacuum hose I want to put back before we bolt the intake on is going to be this one right here. Push that in all the way. Seat the hose clamp. Now let's bolt the intake on. All right, now that the intake is fully seated, I'm going to start all the bolts in. And starting them doesn't quite matter in which pattern you start. There is a sequence to tighten these, and that is starting from the center, working your way in a cross pattern towards the outer bolts. But for now, I just want to make sure that they start onto the threads, and it doesn't really matter what sequence you start them in. The sequence only matters for actually tightening these. So just going to make sure all these bolts on the passenger side are started, which it looks like they all are, so that's great. Move over to the driver's side, start all these in. They're all started, so at this point I'm going to start bottoming them out. On this one right here, just get it bottomed out nice and snug. We'll do the torquing after they're all at the same tightness pretty much, bottomed out. Start here, go across to this one, then here, and so on. The torque for these is 89 inch-pounds. At this point, the sequence definitely matters. So I'm going to follow the same pattern that I did before. Go from here, this would be my first one, 89 inch-pounds. Go over to here, 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 and so on and so forth. At this point, I'm going to check them all one more time. This time I'm going to go around in a circle. The sequence doesn't matter anymore since they're all fully torqued. The only reason I'm checking them is because they have rubber grommets and the intake has rubber gaskets. And usually with those, if you tighten multiple bolts as the item, in this case the intake, squishes down, it'll tend to loosen up the first few. As you can see, it's not the case here. It's not always the case, but it's always a good idea to double check. All right, intake is torqued down. Now we have to reconnect multiple things back here. The first thing that I'm going to do is take this main wiring harness, flip it over, and re-secure it onto the computer. And before I put this on here, since I can move it out of my way now, I'm going to put the stud on. That goes through this harness. This is a ground, so make sure it's clean. That way I can make good contact. This is an 11mm fastener. Make sure that's snug. Now take the rest of the harness, carefully slide it in so you don't bend any of the pins. Once it bottoms out, secure it on there. This is also an 11mm. Clamp this down snug, but don't make it too tight because that's just plastic and it can break. And then take your 10mm socket, tighten this up until it gets snug, and that's what's going to pull the rest of this connector in all the way. If there is resistance, stop immediately because that means something is not right, whether it's the pins that aren't lining up or this is cross-threading or it's just not seated properly. This tightened up, just make it snug. Once it bottoms out, give it an 1/8 of a turn at most, and that's it. It should have made proper connection by now. Over here, tuck the vacuum line back here behind or underneath this wiring harness. That's how it was before. And then reconnect your brake booster to the top of the intake here. Let's get this clamp resecured. It's important that this is properly connected. Like I mentioned earlier, this provides vacuum for your brake assist, so if you don't have this, you don't have assisted brakes. That would be an issue. Now it's time to reconnect the spark plug wires back here. They are different lengths, which does help with reconnecting them the right way. But again, 1, 2, and 3 cylinders, that is. Cylinder number 1, make sure it clicks. Cylinder number 2, and cylinder number 3. Try to cross them as little as possible. It avoids any interference between the wires. Okay, make sure these are fully seated. Up here, resecure this connector or the clip, the retainer, if you still have yours. A lot of times they break. Let's resecure the ignition coil bracket with the 2 8mm headed bolts. Snug it up. Now let's tighten up this EGR valve onto the intake. 2 10mm headed bolts. Get this nice and snug. The torque for these two is 18 foot-pounds. It's important that these are sealed properly, or the EGR valve is sealed properly with these bolts properly tightened so that you don't have an exhaust leak here when the EGR gas is actually passed through. Let's get the throttle body back in position, line it up. For me, because I had to remove the throttle body with the cable attached, I'm going to make sure that lines up, and I'm going to start in my 4 mounting screws. Bottom these out. They are just screwing into plastic, so don't over tighten them. I will torque them. Also, I'm going in a cross pattern for both the tightening and the torquing so that I can seat the throttle body nice and flush up against the intake. The torque for this is 80 inch-pounds. It's important that you don't go over that because not only could you damage the gasket, but this is screwing into plastic, and if this strips out, you need an entire new intake assembly. Going across pattern, once again, 80 inch-pounds. And there you have it. Now we have to do two things. One, secure this bracket, and then put the cruise control cable in. That is if your truck had one. So I'm going to start these two bolts in here. With both of them started, I'm going to hold the bracket in its position that it was in before. You can see where the bolts were. Make them snug. Make sure there isn't too much slop in the cable. If there is a little bit and there wasn't before, it's most likely because this bracket is now too far forward, so pull it back a little. But if for some reason the throttle blade is staying open just a little bit, definitely fix that. Otherwise your engine will never rev down to idle RPM. It'll just stay revved up, and that'd be because this bracket is pulled too far backwards. Now take your cruise control cable, if you had cruise control, slide it in here. Make sure that clicks in, and then let's resecure it on the throttle right here. Snap this into place, and that's done. Now take your intake tube, make sure you put it the right way, not backwards. Slide it onto one end and then the other, and make sure it seats properly and fully on both sides. You don't want any air leaks. There's a vacuum line here for the PCV on the passenger side. Valve cover, click that in. Sometimes you have to manually open this lock so it can actually click in. They get stuck over time. There we go. So that's clicked back in place. Let's tighten the two hose clamps back up. For me, it's just an 8mm socket. With these, once they get snug, just watch it, and when it starts to squeeze down on the hose, that's good. If you can't move it, you're good to go. Over here, I'm going to reconnect the throttle position sensor cable. I'm going to tighten this one up also. Same thing. Once it gets snug, give it one, maybe two more turns, and that's it. Resecure the mass airflow sensor harness onto the intake tube. Let's reconnect the negative battery terminal. Use an 8mm socket to tighten it up. And the way you know it's tightened properly is if it gets snug and you can't spin this, you're good to go. Back down by the radiator. Let's close the petcock, snug it up so that we can actually put some coolant in it now. Use your wrench or some pliers and just make sure it's nice and snug. I like to clean things off with brake parts cleaner. That way I don't mistake all of this for a potential leak in the future. Now take the shield, put it back up where it belongs. Put the push clip in. And then the two bolts. Now let's fill up the cooling system. Open the radiator cap by twisting it counterclockwise. There are two stages to it, so halfway through you'll have to press down. And I'm going to use one of these spill-proof funnels. You can just pour coolant right down in here, but most likely you're going to spill some. And this funnel will help bleed the system because it's going to be the highest point in the cooling system, so naturally air will want to rise up at the top. Fill it with manufacturer-specified coolant until it stops bubbling in the funnel. Once you build up about 1/8 to 1/4 of the way up the funnel in coolant, we'll turn the engine on, let it run, and bleed. Now that it's stopped bubbling, I'm going to turn on the engine, let the water pump circulate, push the air out, and pull the coolant in. We want to wait until the thermostat opens, it reaches operating temperature, and at that point you're sure that it is completely bled. Inside, what you're looking for is to have the fan on low with the blower preferably on vents so you can feel the heat, and the heat all the way up. When you start feeling heat through the vents, you know that the heater core is full of coolant and that it's starting to warm up. And the reason you don't want the blower very high is because otherwise it can tend to cool down the engine, and you're trying to make it warm up as fast as you can. Also watch your temperature gauge. If it goes past the halfway point, it's overheating. Shut it off, and most likely it's just an air bubble, so let it cool down. Push the air bubble out, suck some coolant in, start it again, and it should be good to go. But for now, we're gonna wait for it to warm up. It's warming up, bubbles are coming through. Sometimes massaging the upper radiator hose also helps push more air through, especially in this one where routes up and over the valve cover here has like a hump. Air builds up at the top of it. Squeeze it and let go. And as soon as that thermostat fully opens, it'll push some more air through. It'll let the full flow of the water pump push all the air out. At this point, once it completely stops bubbling and it's up to operating temperature and you're happy with the coolant bleed, cap it off and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.